All right, so yeah, we're the idiots who are trying to actually add bugs to programs. Just to be completely clear, we don't know how to find bugs, we don't know how to mitigate bugs, but we do now know how to add bugs. This is joint work with people from NYU Poly as well as Northeastern, and all the people on the screen deserve a lot of credit. Okay, so to situate this, the problem here is that we're really interested in is actually vulnerability discovery. I'm sure all of you read the newspapers. There are bugs all over the place. We're always getting reports of another thing that's vulnerable. There's a new shell shock or heartbleed every sort of minute, it seems. And it's not the case that academia has been asleep at the wheel. They've been monitoring this problem. They probably started working on this around about the same time as this conference started, back in 1980. This is a paper from 1990, actually, by Bart Miller of Michigan, where he was fuzzing Unix programs to try to find bugs in them. There has also been grammar-based fuzzing, University of Ulo in 1995. Oops. In 2005, CLE, symbolic execution and SAT solving, and there are a bunch of other papers. This is a non-exhaustive list. And then recently, some combinations of fuzzing and symbolic execution have started to surface. Furthermore, industry is paying attention to this sort of thing. There are a bunch of companies have sort of come out of the woodwork and started to offer you things like IDEs that will check your code and see if there are bugs in it. Sort of bug checking as a service. You can submit your code to them, and they'll tell you where all the bugs are. But from our perspective, and I hope a lot of yours, there's a big question hanging in the air, which is, does any of this actually work? No offense. I don't think we know. And the reason is because it's very difficult to measure fundamental figures of merit like miss and false alarm rate for vulnerability discovery tools. So what kind of corpora are out there? This is the sort of thing that we try to find when we're looking into this sort of thing. Corpora that contains ground truth. There's a bug in this program, this particular line in the code exposes the bug, this input creates that bug or manifests that bug. There are resources like the National Vulnerability Database and CVE. These things are both from, I think, MITRE. And they're great resources, but they don't have the kind of, if you ever tried to use them to actually test whether your vulnerability discovery tool works, they don't have the kind of resources that you want. NIST has something called SAMate, which is also good. ExploitDB and Metasploit have a little bit more details, tend to be on closed source. We've created a couple of corpora which have been good and been cited many, many times. Part of the confounding problem here is that bugs are worth tons and tons of money. 5, 6 figures is not uncommon, and so people aren't sharing these things. So a little bit more about the sources. We think of them as being sort of four ways to collect vulnerability corpora. You can wait until your program crashes, and those are really realistic, but it's a tiny corpus. You can search for things using math or fuzzers or staring in IDA Pro or something like that, and they're pretty high quality, but it's, again, low yield. You can create bugs by injecting them into programs, and those are pretty realistic, but they're low to medium yield. And you can synthesize things, writing like a Python script or something like that creates lots of buggy programs for you. We're trying to hit this sweet spot, and in Lava, we try to inject bugs into real programs to get good realism, but we're kind of synthesizing things so we have low cost and high yield. Okay, what's the concept here? We want Lava bugs to be cheap and plentiful. We need them to be realistic as possible. We want there to be a triggering input. We want them to manifest themselves for only one input or a few inputs. A bug isn't very interesting if for every single input it triggers itself. And we want there to be some kind of security critical effect. Some caveats, which we don't think are actually important. We work only from source code, C programs, Linux, and for the moment, we're actually just focusing on buffer overflows. So this is large-scale automated vulnerability addition. We use a combination of static, but mostly dynamic analysis to find attacker-controlled data that can be used to introduce new code that creates a bug. And what we do is actually change the program source code and the input at the same time to make sure that the bug really manifests itself. The special sauce is here some new taint-based measures that make this possible. So we make use of this Panda Panda whole system emulator, which we actually wrote. There's a URL down there. It's on the internet. You can get it from GitHub. It's a whole system dynamic analysis, so all processes in the kernel are implicated or analyzed. It works on binaries, so you don't need to compile your source code. All library code is automatically included. Weird instructions are handled properly, we think. But most critically for analysis purposes, many labels are supported. So every byte in like a 1 megabyte or 10 megabyte file gets a different label. We also combine labels into sets to represent computation. We think it's fast enough for our purposes, which again are analytical. We're not trying to do defense here. So what are these taint-based measures I've been talking about? This is kind of the heart of LAVA and how it does its work. One is called liveness, and that is, I admit, I'm stealing that term from other things. The basic idea there is actually quite simple, is to count the number of branches a particular input byte is used to decide. And this lets us know how much effect upon the control flow that particular byte has. And this is critical because later we're going to want to modify that particular byte in order to trigger a bug somewhere. So we don't want it to send the program off on a completely different control flow branch. The other critical measure that we came up with is called taint compute number. And this is really the depth of the tree of computation used to compute a particular LVAL at a particular point in the execution trace. So it's basically how complicated a function of input bytes is a particular value at a point in the trace. So together, these two things give us what we call dead, uncomplicated, and available data. It's available at this particular point, or DUAs. This is really the attacker-controlled data that can be used to create a vulnerability. Now, this is actually kind of a page out of the systems exploitation, finding vulnerabilities book. This is the sort of thing that people do all the time with programs. They try to find where they, as an attacker, they know user input is actually available deep within a program and they have enough control over it, and then they see what they can get out of it. Here's a couple of graphs overlaid on top of this. These are probably too detailed to go into in some depth, but basically time is along the horizontal axis, and along the vertical axis is the input byte number, that label. And so these are files, so it's input byte position. And basically, the darker the spot is, the higher the liveness is, or the higher the taint compute number is. So the more control it has over control flow, or more complicated a function it is of the inputs. And so in this case, you want whiter things. And so this allows us to identify that in this particular input bytes, 28 through 32 are dead, uncomplicated, and available. So we can use them to create a bug. So here's the architecture of the system. We use Clang. It's not really that interesting to instrument the source code with taint queries because that's how we do it at the moment. We use a particular input, and we use Panda. In order to do its taint analysis, it works on a record and then replay under complicated dynamic analysis kind of approach. And so we record the processing of that input with Panda, and then under replay, we do a detailed taint analysis to find this attacker-controlled data, as well as attack points later on in the code. Stick those into a database. These are potentially injectable bugs. These are heuristic measures, so there's no guarantees here. And then finally, we instantiate. We actually inject the bug with Clang, compile, and then create a modified version of the input and see if we get bugs, and so we get some yield. Here's an example of how this works. Let's say the Panda taint analysis tells that the bytes 0 through 3 in a buffer buff at a particular line in the source code is attacker controlled. That's what that looks like. Then we also learned from Panda that there's a pointer that we can corrupt later on in the trace that's in a completely different file, and the dynamic analysis tells us both of these things. And so then our job to create a bug is to just introduce data flow between these two that makes those 4 bytes in the beginning of buff do something terrible to that pointer that's &info. Furthermore, to make it so that this is triggerable, so it doesn't happen sort of all the time, we introduce some kind of a switch, which means that the bytes basically have to be a particular value, or have a lot of constraints upon them. Here's what the actual changes to the source code look like in this case. It's not really that complicated or pretty. We basically siphon off those first 4 bytes in the buffer, pack them into a uint32, send them to a global function which holds onto them, and then later on in the program, we just use them to corrupt the pointer. We are working on making this much more natural kind of data flow, realistic data flow, but for the moment, this is the simplest thing to do, and it works. So how well does this work? We have this complete working system, and we've used it to inject lots of bugs in programs. In particular, we took 4 open source programs between 10,000 lines of code and 2 million lines of code. injected 2,000 bugs into each of them, or attempted to. When we get varying yield, so that second to last column is yield, we get between 10 and 50% yield. And that's just because we try the specific change to the source code with the right modification to the right part of the input, because remember we have taint, and so we know what parts of the input to modify, and see if it actually triggers a segmentation fault. We also check to see if the original input does not cause any trouble anymore, or now. And with this, we've been able to inject over 2,000 bugs into these 4 different programs. The kind of interesting thing about this here is that one of the programs that we injected bugs into, Wireshark's command line utility, there are over 1.2 million potential bugs in our database. So if we extrapolate with the yield of 17.7%, it seems as though we may be able to add about 200,000 bugs into Wireshark. And there are lots of caveats here, but if anything, our intuition from this is these numbers are small. We can add way more than this if we want to, because the way in which we're tracking duas and finding them is incomplete. There are many more opportunities than this. So we've used this to create a couple of different corpora. I'm going to talk about one of them in particular, which is this LavaMcorpora. Basically what we did is we took 4 different coreutils programs, which have been used to evaluate lots of different tools for finding bugs in programs. And in each of those, we added as many bugs as we could. We're actually able to put bugs in at the same time. And I think we added over 2,000 bugs to these 4 programs, and then we took 2 open source tools that are vulnerability discovery tools, and we determined what their detection rates are for these bugs that we can inject. And we saw that, let's see, one of them was a fuzzer, and the other is symbolic execution and sat solving. We're not naming them, and the reason is because this is a kind of incomplete evaluation. We just wanted to see if this could be used for evaluation, and we think it can. But we'd like to do a much more careful evaluation. The detection rate is less than 2%. We injected over 2,000 and about 40 were found by the tools combined. So that's actually great. I mean, we're really happy that they found some of them, but clearly there's work to be done. So a big question hanging in the air here is realism. It's totally a concern. We get that. It's very hard to quantify. And as you can see, the kind of modifications we're making to the source code are very artifacty. We're changing it in this kind of weird way with this data flow through a global and whatever, which we're actually working on. We know how to fix. But what we did do is we think it's a concern, but I think what's important here is whether or not these lava bugs can be used to evaluate things, and they may still be able to, even in their current state. What we did was we did a measurement of what fraction of the execution trace needs to be analyzed basically correctly in order to be able to get this right. And so we found that the place at which the duo was siphoned off is sort of all over the execution trace. And in fact, if anything, it's sort of near the end of the execution trace. And so that indicates to us that if anything, the lava bugs that are inserted are kind of hard. They might be too hard for these, for tools in general, because we're sort of inserting them near the end. Actually, we can pick and choose. We could have chosen earlier in the trace. We just didn't know that at the time that we were doing that analysis. But we can do that later. So in summary, we have a working system that automates the construction of large corpora for study and assessment. We think this can be the basis for coming up with ground truth, basically on demand, to test whether or not vulnerability discovery tools even work. The novel taint-based measures that we used are key here. Liveness and taint compute number are not guarantees, but they're perfectly adequate for coming up with the bugs that we came up with. We get yields between 10 and 50%. In terms of future directions, we'd like to use this in order to create. We don't actually want to be in the business of evaluating other people's vulnerability discovery tools. That's no fun. We'd love to have a continuous online competition where you push a button, get a corpus. Maybe want to test a hypothesis, do that, then throw it away, push a button, get another corpus. Instead, maybe you push a button, you determine whether your tool works, you submit a result, and there's a leaderboard. And the first person who actually submits results is going to be in first place, and you're going to topple that person if you have a better system. Furthermore, we've run capture the flag tournaments, and it's a big problem in those, in actually being able to reuse the infrastructure and the challenges. But we think a tool like Lava could allow us to do that. We can push a button and add 100 new write what where kind of vulnerabilities into something, or information disclosures, and have a new CTF. And that could be really wonderful. We have to do some work to assess and improve the realism of Lava bugs, and I think that's going to make more sense when they become more complicated. They're not just these corrupt a pointer in this not really exploitable way, but interesting in terms of vulnerability discovery. We do want to add to other kinds of vulnerabilities, and we're going to work on that. But I think we first want to try to introduce more interesting effects. We want the buffer overflows definitely to be exploitable, first in the context of CTFs and in other situations too. And that's all I have. Any questions?
All right, questions?
Hey, I'm Jan Shartashvili from UCSB, and I was wondering, did you make any modifications to your fuzzer to make it work on these binaries? What fuzzer did you use? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I'm not going to tell you which fuzzer that we used. We did not make any modifications. We ran the fuzzer and the symbolic execution and SAT solving tools each. I think we gave them 5 hours, just completely pulled out of the air because we were running out of time. But 1 hour seemed too short, and 24 hours was just like, forget it. No, we didn't make any modifications, but we worked hard to try to understand how we tried to be users, basically. We didn't just like pull them off the shelf, try them, and then they just failed and we laughed at them.
But that fuzzer is a publicly available one?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Awesome work.
Thank you.
Oh. Any other questions? So let me have just a quick question. So this is only for injecting just buffer overflow. Do you expect any more challenges or difficulties if you want to expand this work by including additional vulnerabilities such as use after free or the other types?
Right. It's a great question. We do anticipate difficulties, but we think the ability to locate the attacker-controlled data within the trace and within the program is a fundamental building block for any kind of vulnerability because it has to be triggerable by the input, otherwise it's not particularly interesting. And we know how to do that, and we're working on use after free and amongst other kinds of vulnerabilities. We think many can be adapted to this framework, yes. I think some things are definitely fundamentally off limits, like crypto flaws. Okay. I don't know what that means in this context. I don't know how to add those. But maybe some clever person can figure it out. Finding the attacker-controlled data is really important.
That's very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
another question.
Did you do any characterization of why the analyses didn't find these bugs? Was it because all the current analyzers are trying to get bugs that are human caused, and so is it just because they're too artificial, or because there limits the number levels of indirection, or what?
What we found, we did some analysis of that, and it's in the paper. What we found is that they are mostly finding bugs that are shallow. They're finding bugs that are early on in the execution trace. So fuzzers and symbolic execution, they sort of have the same path explosion problem. They need to try to explore all possible ways through the program and therefore all possible inputs. And only one input or two or something like that actually trigger these bugs. Mm-hmm. That was the analysis that we found that they...
Right, okay. And that's also true of the stack analyzers, or do you...
They also seem to get stuck near the beginning of the program, yeah. Yep. Needle in a haystack.
Okay.
It seems that I would have very good sort of bug finding success rate if I use pandas as my bug finding constraint solver.
Panda doesn't do constraint solving, but you could try to take this same approach, this Lava approach, and flip it on its head and use it to try to find bugs. Yes,
because you're basically.
And we may be working on that.
Right. No, but I mean, I would find. My point is the success rate would be good against the bugs that Lava outputs, right? So if I use the same search mechanism that you use to find places to inject bugs, to find bugs, then sort of I would ace the metrics.
Possibly, but it's a fundamentally easier problem, adding bugs to programs. And so, even if you use exactly the same technique that we use to inject these bugs, you still have to look through all the various possibilities and try everything, whereas we don't have to try everything. We are adding one along a specific execution trace. So in particular, what you don't have when you're trying to do vulnerability discovery is the input that we use to do our taint analysis. we're not going to give that to you. So you need to find the one input that gets you down the same trace to add bugs. And so I don't think there's an advantage.
All right, thanks.
All right.